Captain Haywan stared at her scanner display and felt her blood turn cold. 3 days ago, her ship Farsight had been on a routine patrol mission near the Outer Rim when something impossible happened. A massive tear in space itself had opened, right in front of them, and from that tear came the largest starship anyone had ever seen. The vessel was 15 kilometers long and covered in strange metal that seemed to shift and change color in the starlight. Deep scars covered its hull, like battle wounds from 1,000 wars. Some of the damage looked fresh, while other marks appeared ancient, beyond measure. The ship's design made no sense according to everything the Galactic Coalition knew about starship construction. Hay-1 had immediately sent word to Coalition Command, and now she stood in the Great Council chamber aboard Unity's Promise, explaining what she had witnessed to representatives from dozens of alien species. The Valari delegates stood like living crystals catching the light, while the insectoid Threx clicked their mandibles in agitation. Gaseous beings from the Nimari Collective floated in their containment suits, while reptilian saurians hissed softly, among themselves. Admiral Taman of the Coalition Defense Fleet leaned forward in his chair and studied the holographic display showing the mysterious vessel. The ship hung in space like a sleeping giant, and every sensor reading defied explanation. Its power signature was unlike anything in Coalition databases, and the quantum resonance patterns suggested technology that should not exist. The ship had identified itself as Eternal Dawn and claimed to be crewed by humans. This caused immediate confusion in the council chamber because humans were listed in Coalition files as a primitive species confined to one small planet in an unremarkable star system. They had barely developed basic spaceflight and showed no signs of advanced technology. Yet here was a human vessel that dwarfed even the Coalition's largest battleships. Counselor Zeph of the Valari spoke in his crystalline voice that rang like musical chimes. He pointed out that the ship's quantum signature dated it as over 50,000 years old, making it the oldest functional starship in all recorded galactic history. This was impossible because 50,000 years ago, most current Coalition species were still developing primitive agriculture on their homeworlds. The human commander of the vessel had identified himself as Ji-Hoon and requested permission to approach Coalition space. His message was brief and spoke of humanity wishing to return home after a long journey. The transmission quality was perfect, despite coming from such an ancient ship, and the human spoke in flawless galactic standard, as if he had been using the language for centuries. Dr. Yunhee, the Coalition's chief archaeologist, raised her hand to speak. She had been studying the ship's energy patterns and found traces of materials that matched artifacts from the galaxy's oldest ruins. These ruins predated even the earliest Coalition records and contained technology that modern science could barely understand. Finding similar energy signatures on a human ship suggested connections that should not exist. Ambassador So Young from the Diplomatic Corps suggested that perhaps their records about humans were incomplete. Maybe this species had once possessed advanced technology, but suffered some catastrophe that reduced them to their current primitive state. This would explain how they could build such a vessel in the distant past while appearing backward in the present day. Captain Haywan activated another display showing detailed scans of the ship's structure. The hull was composed of some kind of living metal that repaired itself when damaged. Energy conduits ran through the ship like a circulatory system, carrying power from sources that registered as miniature stars. Weapon systems were integrated throughout the vessel, but their design principles were completely foreign to Coalition understanding. Admiral Taman stood and began pacing as he spoke. He pointed out that a ship this size could carry millions of crew members and possessed enough firepower to threaten entire star systems. If humans had kept this vessel hidden for 50,000 years, then what else might they be concealing? The implications for galactic security were staggering and demanded immediate investigation. The Threx representative Kickstar spoke in clicking syllables translated by the universal communicator. She noted that the ship had emerged from what appeared to be a dimensional rift rather than normal hyperspace travel. This suggested technology for manipulating space and time that surpassed anything the Coalition possessed. Such capabilities could revolutionize transportation and communication across the galaxy. Counselor Nim Ara of the Saurians flicked her forked tongue and hissed her concerns. She reminded the Council that species with advanced technology often became conquerors seeking to dominate less developed civilizations. Perhaps these humans had been waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves and claim superiority over the Coalition. HFY brought up another troubling detail from her sensor logs. The ship showed signs of having survived battles with weapon types that no current species possessed. Damage patterns indicated exposure to energy weapons, plasma cannons, particle beams, and stranger things that her computers could not identify. Some of the battle scars appeared to have been inflicted by weapons that could tear holes in reality itself. Dr. Yoon-hee accessed her archaeological database and began cross-referencing the ship's energy signatures with ancient ruins scattered throughout Coalition space. She found matches at dozens of sites, including some on worlds where no sentient life had ever evolved. This suggested that whoever built those ruins had also been connected to the humans and their impossible vessel. The council chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. If humans had possessed this level of technology 50,000 years ago, then they had been spacefaring when most Coalition species were still primitive. They might have built the ancient ruins that modern archaeologists studied with such fascination. The entire understanding of galactic history might need to be rewritten. Ambassador So Young proposed sending a diplomatic mission to make formal contact with the human vessel. She argued that until they knew more about human intentions, it would be unwise to make assumptions about their threat level. Perhaps these humans could provide answers to archaeological mysteries that had puzzled scientists for millennia. Admiral Tae-min disagreed and wanted to send a military fleet to surround the human ship. He believed that anything this powerful represented a potential threat to Coalition security. Better to negotiate from a position of strength than risk being caught unprepared if human intentions proved hostile. The debate continued for hours, as different species voiced their concerns and suggestions. Some wanted to welcome the humans as potential allies, while others demanded they be treated as dangerous unknowns. The Volari proposed offering advanced technology in exchange for information, while the Threx suggested establishing a quarantine zone around the human vessel. Finally, Councillor Zeph called for a vote on how to proceed. The decision was close, but diplomacy won over military action. Ambassador So Young would lead a first contact team aboard the diplomatic vessel Harmony Bridge. They would approach the human ship under peaceful protocols and attempt to establish formal relations. As the council session ended, HFY remained behind studying the sensor readings from her encounter with Eternal Dawn. Something about the ship disturbed her beyond its impossible age and advanced technology. The way it moved through space seemed familiar, as if she had seen similar vessels before in ancient archives or half-remembered dreams. She pulled up star charts showing the location where the dimensional rift had appeared. The coordinates placed it near the galactic core in a region that most species avoided due to dangerous radiation levels and gravitational anomalies. Perhaps the humans had been hiding there all this time, waiting for some unknown signal to emerge and make contact. The more HFY studied the data, the more questions arose. How had humans developed such advanced technology in secret? Why reveal themselves now after 50,000 years of hiding? What kind of journey had they been on that required such a massive vessel? And most troubling of all, what enemies had they been fighting that could inflict such terrible damage on their ship? As she prepared to return to her own vessel, HFY made a private note in her log. Something about this situation felt like the beginning of a much larger story. The arrival of Eternal Dawn might change everything the Coalition thought they knew about the galaxy and their place in it. Ambassador So Young stood on the bridge of Harmony Bridge as her diplomatic vessel approached the massive human carrier. Even from a distance of several kilometers, Eternal Dawn filled their entire view screen like a metallic mountain floating in space. The ship's hull reflected starlight in patterns that seemed almost alive, and So Young could see weapon ports and docking bays that could accommodate entire fleets. Beside her stood Kyung Ho, the Coalition's best xenolinguistics expert who had been working frantically to prepare communication protocols for this first contact mission. His translation computers had been running constant analysis of the human transmissions, but surprisingly the humans seemed to already possess universal translators that were more advanced than Coalition standard equipment. the human commander. Ji-hoon had granted them permission to dock at one of the smaller bays near the ship's midsection. As Harmony Bridge slowly approached the designated coordinates, So-young watched massive doors slide open to reveal a hangar that could hold dozens of Coalition vessels. The interior was brightly lit and showed no signs of the age that the ship's exterior suggested. Dr. Min-jun, the team's technology specialist, monitored his instruments with growing amazement. The ship's power readings were off every scale, and energy flowed through conduits in patterns that defied known physics. Gravity generators maintained perfect artificial gravity throughout the vessel, while atmospheric processors created breathable air for multiple species without any apparent effort. As their ship settled onto the hangar deck, So-young could see human figures waiting to greet them. They wore uniforms that looked both practical and elegant in dark blue material that seemed to absorb and reflect light at the same time. The humans appeared remarkably similar to Coalition database images, but carried themselves with a confidence that suggested vast experience with interstellar travel. The hangar itself stretched beyond sight in both directions, like a vast underground city. Hundreds of smaller craft were parked in neat rows, including fighter shuttles and exploration vessels that used design principles completely unknown to Coalition engineers. Some of the vehicles looked new, while others showed the same ancient wear as the ship's exterior. Commander Ji-hoon stepped forward as the diplomatic team descended from their vessel. He appeared to be in his 30s with dark hair and eyes that seemed much older than his face suggested. His manner was polite but formal, as if he had participated in similar first contact scenarios many times before. The universal translator rendered his words in perfect galactic standard. Behind Ji-hoon stood a woman he introduced as Chief Engineer. Bora, who seemed equally young but possessed an air of technical expertise that impressed even Dr. Min-jun. She gestured casually toward control panels that materialized from the hangar walls at her touch, and spoke about the ship's systems with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent decades working with such technology. So-young presented the formal diplomatic credentials authorized by the Coalition Council, while Kyung-ho recorded every detail of the human language and behavior for later analysis. The humans accepted the documents with gracious ceremony, but their technology scanned and translated the materials, instantly suggesting information processing capabilities far beyond Coalition standards. Ji-hoon offered to provide a tour of certain sections of Eternal Dawn, so the diplomatic team could better understand human capabilities and intentions. He warned that the ship was vast, and they would only see a small fraction of its facilities, but promised to answer questions about human history and their reasons for making contact with the Coalition. As they walked through corridors that seemed to stretch to the horizon, So-young noticed details that troubled her. Memorial walls lined many passages displaying billions of human names arranged in categories that suggested different time periods spanning thousands of years. The names were inscribed in living metal that glowed softly and seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Dr. Min-jun examined the ship's construction with growing disbelief. The corridors were made from materials that repaired themselves when scratched, and walls that could become transparent or opaque at the crew's mental command. Energy flowed through the ship like blood through veins, carrying power from sources that registered as controlled nuclear fusion reactions or possibly something even more exotic. Bora noticed his fascination and began explaining some of the ship's basic systems. She spoke about gravity wells that automatically adjusted to accommodate different species and atmospheric processors that could create any combination of gases needed for alien life forms. Her casual manipulation of the ship's controls made Coalition technology look primitive by comparison. They passed through sections that contained vast gardens where humans worked among plants from hundreds of different worlds. The agricultural areas stretched for kilometers and used growing techniques that produced incredible yields from minimal space. Kyung-ho noted that some of the plants came from worlds that had been extinct for millennia, according to Coalition botanical records. When So-young asked about the ship's crew size, Ji-hoon paused before explaining that Eternal Dawn currently carried over 2 million humans in various states of activity. Many were in suspended animation, while others maintained the ship's operations, and a significant number were engaged in duties he described only as essential maintenance tasks that required constant attention. The tour continued through laboratories, where human scientists worked with materials and energy forms that Dr. Min-jun could not identify. Some experiments seemed to involve manipulating space and time itself, while others dealt with forces that existed outside normal reality. The humans handled these dangerous energies with practiced ease, suggesting long familiarity with such advanced research. So Young was particularly interested in the ship's navigation systems when they visited the bridge. Star charts covered walls showing the locations of stellar phenomena that included galaxies beyond Coalition exploration. Some charts marked the positions of civilizations that had existed long before any current species had developed space travel according to the timestamps displayed. Kyung-ho asked about humanity's origins and their connection to the primitive humans listed in Coalition databases. Ji-hoon's expression became carefully neutral as he explained that the humans on Earth were indeed their people, but had been placed there for specific reasons related to what he called recovery and healing after a long period of difficult service. When pressed for details about this service, Ji-hoon would only say that humanity had been engaged in what he termed the Long War. He refused to elaborate on the nature of this conflict, except to say that it had required great sacrifices from his people and had been necessary to protect things that others might not understand or appreciate. Bo-Ra showed them weapon systems that could apparently crack planets or destroy entire fleets with single shots. The weapons used principles based on controlled black holes, dimensional manipulation, and energy forms that existed outside normal space. She explained these systems with the same casual air she had used for discussing atmospheric processors. Dr. Min-jun asked about the ship's age and how humans had maintained such technology for 50,000 years. Bo-Ra smiled and explained that Eternal Dawn was actually one of their newer vessels, though it had been extensively rebuilt and upgraded over the millennia. She mentioned other ships in their fleet that were much older and more powerful. As the tour continued, So Young noticed that many areas of the ship were restricted, and Ji-hoon politely but firmly refused to discuss certain systems or sections. He mentioned that some capabilities were not appropriate for sharing until formal relationships had been established between humanity and the Coalition. They visited medical facilities that could apparently heal injuries and diseases that Coalition medicine considered incurable. Human doctors worked with equipment that could regenerate lost limbs, repair genetic damage, and extend lifespans far beyond natural limits. Some patients appeared to be from non-human species, though Ji-hoon did not explain how they had come to be aboard a human vessel. The most disturbing part of the tour came when they passed through what Ji-hoon called the memorial sections. Vast chambers contained the preserved remains and personal effects of humans who had died in the Long War. The scale of the losses was staggering, with entire wings dedicated to different battles and campaigns that had apparently lasted for centuries. When Kyung-ho asked about these conflicts, Ji-hoon's demeanor changed completely. His eyes took on a haunted quality as he spoke about enemies that existed outside normal reality and threats that required constant vigilance to contain. He mentioned battles fought in dimensions where time moved differently and wars against forces that could unmake entire star systems. As the tour concluded, So Young realized that she had more questions than answers about these humans and their impossible ship. Their technology surpassed Coalition capabilities by thousands of years, yet they claimed to be the same species as the primitive humans on Earth. Their references to ancient wars and mysterious enemies suggested involvement in galactic events that predated recorded history. Ji-hoon escorted them back to their vessel with the same formal courtesy he had shown throughout the visit. Coalition Intelligence Director In-soo stood before the emergency session of the High Council with data that would change everything they thought they knew about galactic history. His deep scans of Eternal Dawn had revealed technology that challenged the fundamental understanding of what was possible in the known universe. The ship contained temporal stabilizers that could slow or accelerate time in localized areas and reality anchors that seemed designed to prevent space itself from being altered or damaged. Most disturbing were weapon systems powered by controlled black holes and energy sources that appeared to harvest power from parallel dimensions. Such technology should not exist according to every scientific principle the Coalition understood. In-soo activated a holographic display showing the ship's internal structure revealed through quantum resonance scanning. Over 2 million humans were indeed aboard the vessel, but many were in states that defied medical explanation. Some appeared to be in standard suspended animation, while others were in what human records called meditative stasis, where their brain activity suggested they were actively engaged in some form of mental labor. Dr. Yun-hee had made breakthrough discoveries while analyzing data streams provided by the diplomatic mission. Her archaeological databases contained fragments of information about humanity scattered throughout the galaxy's oldest ruins and artifacts. When she compiled this data, a disturbing pattern emerged that suggested humans had once been the dominant species in galactic civilization. The evidence was scattered across thousands of worlds and hidden in ruins so ancient that most species had forgotten they existed. Inscriptions in human languages appeared on monuments that predated the coalition by tens of thousands of years. Architectural styles that matched human preferences could be found on worlds where no human had ever officially set foot, according to current records. Yun-hee presented her findings to the Council with growing excitement despite the implications for galactic security. She had discovered references to humanity not as primitive beings, but as the guardians and protectors of galactic civilization. Ancient texts spoke of humans as warriors who fought against threats that other species could not even perceive or understand. Meanwhile, aboard Eternal Dawn, Ambassador So Young continued her diplomatic discussions with Commander Ji-hoon and Chief Engineer Bo-ra. The humans had agreed to share more information about their history in exchange for formal recognition of their status as a sovereign species with rights to travel freely through coalition space. Bo-ra explained to So Young that humanity had not evolved on Earth as coalition records suggested. Earth had been chosen as a recovery world where humanity could heal and rebuild after what she termed the Great Catastrophe. The planet was meant to be a temporary refuge, but circumstances had forced them to remain there much longer than originally planned. The revelation came when Ji-hoon finally agreed to provide access to humanity's historical archives. The data was staggering in scope, covering 50,000 years of continuous records detailing events that had been completely erased from galactic memory. The files described a war that had lasted for millennia against enemies that existed outside normal reality. According to human records, entities called Void Devourers had begun invading the galaxy from another dimension approximately 50,000 years ago. These beings consumed reality itself, turning matter, energy, space, and time into nothing but empty void. Every species in the galaxy had been helpless against them, because conventional weapons and defenses could not affect enemies that existed partially outside normal space. Humanity had been the only species capable of fighting the Void Devourers, due to unique characteristics of human neural structure that allowed them to perceive and interact with extra-dimensional entities. Human minds could somehow anchor reality around them and maintain stable spacetime, even when the Void Devourers attempted to unmake the fundamental laws of physics. The Long War had required humanity to sacrifice everything they had built over thousands of years of civilization. 90% of their population had died fighting enemies that could erase entire star systems from existence. Human worlds had been abandoned or destroyed, and their technology had been rebuilt specifically for fighting extra-dimensional threats rather than supporting normal civilization. Insu received this information through secure channels and immediately understood the implications for coalition security. If humanity had spent 50,000 years fighting extra-dimensional invaders, then the current peace and prosperity of galactic civilization existed only because humans had been maintaining barriers against threats that most species could not even comprehend. The human archives contained detailed technical specifications for weapons and defenses designed to fight enemies that existed outside normal reality. Reality anchor systems could stabilize space-time against attacks that sought to unmake the fundamental structure of the universe. Quantum resonance weapons could harm beings that phase in and out of normal dimensions at will. Dr. Yun-hee cross-referenced human historical data with her archaeological findings and discovered that ancient ruins throughout coalition space had been built by humans during the Long War. These facilities had served as monitoring stations and defensive installations designed to detect and prevent Void Devourer incursions into normal space. The terrible truth was that humanity had never actually won the Long War. They had succeeded in driving the Void Devourers back into their native dimension and sealing most of the rifts that allowed passage between realities. But the dimensional barriers required constant maintenance and vigilance to prevent the entities from breaking through again. Ships like Eternal Dawn were not exploration vessels or warships in any conventional sense. They were mobile fortresses, designed to patrol the dimensional boundaries and maintain the barriers that kept extra-dimensional threats contained. The 2 million humans aboard were not crew members in the traditional sense, but guardians whose mental disciplines were necessary to stabilize reality itself. Bora explained to a horrified So Young that many of the humans in meditative stasis were actively working to maintain dimensional barriers through pure concentration and willpower. Their consciousness was focused on perceiving and reinforcing the boundaries between dimensions to prevent void devourers from finding weak points they could exploit. This revelation explained why humanity had remained hidden for so long. They had not been primitive or backward, but rather focused entirely on a war that other species could not understand or assist with. Human civilization had been rebuilt around the single purpose of preventing extra-dimensional invasion and protecting a galaxy that did not even know it was under threat. In-Su presented his analysis to the High Council with grim conclusions about coalition security. Every technological advance, every peaceful trade agreement, every cultural achievement of galactic civilization had been possible only because humanity was continuously fighting a war that never ended. The coalition owed its very existence to human sacrifice and had never known it. The implications were staggering for galactic politics and military planning. If the dimensional barriers were failing, then the void devourers would soon begin probing for weaknesses in reality itself. Coalition weapons and defenses would be completely useless against enemies that could alter the fundamental laws of physics simply by existing in normal space. Admiral Tae-min demanded to know why humanity had never requested assistance or informed other species about the threat. Ji-hoon's response was simple and devastating. How could they explain enemies that existed outside reality to species that barely understood their own dimensional physics? What help could civilizations offer against threats they could not perceive or comprehend? The human commander provided sensor logs showing void devourer activity increasing along the dimensional boundaries over the past several decades. The entities were becoming more aggressive in their attempts to break through, and the barriers that had held them for 50,000 years were showing signs of strain and deterioration. Yun-hee made another disturbing discovery when she analyzed the timeline of galactic development. Coalition species had experienced rapid technological advancement only during periods when human dimensional barriers were strongest. When the barriers weakened, technological progress slowed dramatically, suggesting that extra-dimensional interference affected the basic laws of physics that technology depended upon. The evidence was overwhelming and terrifying. The Coalition's comfortable assumption that they lived in a universe governed by predictable physical laws was completely wrong. Reality itself was under constant attack by entities that sought to reduce everything to empty void, and only human vigilance prevented the complete destruction of normal space-time. So Young asked the question that everyone was thinking but afraid to voice. If humanity had been fighting this war for 50,000 years and the barriers were now failing, what would happen when the void devourers finally broke through? Ji-hoon's answer was simple and absolute. Without adequate preparation and cooperation from all galactic species, every civilization in the known universe would cease to exist within a matter of years. Captain Hae-won was conducting routine patrol duties near the Valari homeworld when her sensors detected something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Space itself was beginning to twist and bend in patterns that her instruments could barely register. Reality distortions were appearing throughout Coalition space like tears in the fabric of the universe itself. Her science officer, Young-sik, called out readings that should have been impossible according to every known law of physics. Gravitational fields were fluctuating without any mass to generate them, and electromagnetic radiation was behaving in ways that violated fundamental constants. Most disturbing of all were the readings that suggested empty space was somehow becoming more empty, as if existence itself was being drained away. The first sign of real disaster came when an entire star system in the outer territories simply ceased to exist, not destroyed or consumed, but erased so completely that even the gravitational effects of its former presence vanished from space. Long-range sensors could find no debris, no radiation signature, no evidence that 7 planets and their star had ever existed at all. Admiral Tae-min received emergency reports from across Coalition space as similar reality distortions began appearing near major population centers. His military commanders reported that their weapons had no effect on whatever was causing the spatial anomalies. Plasma cannons passed harmlessly through areas where space-time was becoming unstable, and particle beams simply disappeared when they encountered the growing zones of wrongness. Aboard Eternal Dawn, Commander Ji-hoon activated protocols that had been waiting for 50,000 years. Throughout the massive vessel, humans began awakening from their meditative stasis as warning systems detected the failure of dimensional barriers that had protected reality since the end of the Long War. The ship's corridors filled with purposeful activity as 2 million Guardians prepared for a war that most galactic species could not even comprehend. Among those awakening was Dong-hyun, a veteran of the original Void War, who had spent millennia in stasis, maintaining the dimensional barriers through pure mental discipline. His eyes opened for the first time in centuries and immediately focused on displays showing the extent of dimensional breach activity throughout Coalition space. The enemy had finally found enough weaknesses to begin their return to normal reality. Dr. Yun-hee made another horrifying discovery while analyzing the pattern of reality distortions. The breaches were not random but followed specific geometric arrangements that suggested intelligence behind their placement. Something was systematically weakening the barriers between dimensions and testing Coalition defenses to identify the most vulnerable targets for major assault. Chief Engineer Bo-ra explained to a gathering of Coalition scientists that their entire understanding of physics would need to be rebuilt to fight this enemy. The Void Devourers existed partially outside normal space-time, which meant they could ignore laws of conservation of energy-matter conversion and even causality itself. Conventional weapons were useless because the entities could simply choose not to be affected by them. The Coalition's proud military fleets proved helpless when the first Void Devourers began manifesting in normal space near the crystal cities of the Valari homeworld. Energy weapons passed through the entities without effect, while the mere presence of the extra-dimensional beings caused Coalition ship systems to malfunction as the stable laws of physics became unreliable in their vicinity. Hae-won watched in horror as Valari crystal spires that had stood for 10,000 years began to fade from existence. The aliens inside were not killed or destroyed, but simply ceased to be as if they had never existed at all. The Void Devourers consumed not just matter and energy, but the very concept of existence itself, leaving behind emptiness that was more complete than any vacuum. Admiral Taemin ordered his fleets to retreat from areas showing dimensional instability, but even withdrawal proved difficult as the Void Devourers began affecting space-time in ways that made normal navigation impossible. Hyperspace jumps failed. When the mathematical constants that enabled faster-than-light travel became unreliable, and some ships found themselves trapped in regions where time moved at different rates. Ji-hoon contacted Coalition Command with an offer of assistance, but warned that accepting human help would require fundamental changes in how galactic civilization operated. Fighting the Void Devourers was not just a matter of superior weapons or tactics, but required a complete transformation of consciousness and understanding about the nature of reality itself. The human commander explained that Void Devourer entities existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, which allowed them to attack normal space from angles that three-dimensional beings could not perceive or defend against. Only minds trained in specific mental disciplines could perceive these attacks and mount effective resistance against enemies that treated physical laws as optional guidelines. Dong-hyun took command of emergency training programs designed to teach Coalition species the mental techniques necessary for fighting extra-dimensional threats. The process was agonizing for non-human minds, as it required abandoning comfortable assumptions about reality and learning to perceive dimensions that most consciousness could not normally access. Bo-ra led crash programs to retrofit Coalition technology with human reality anchor systems, but the work proved nearly impossible. Human technology was not just more advanced, but based on completely different principles that required operators to maintain specific mental states while using the equipment. Most Coalition species found this level of consciousness control beyond their natural capabilities. The learning curve was steep and bloody as Coalition forces attempted to adapt to fighting enemies that could alter reality itself. For every successful engagement, dozens of ships were lost to attacks that violated every known principle of warfare. Void Devourers could appear inside supposedly secure vessels, strike from directions that did not exist, and use weapons that unmade their targets at the quantum level. Dr. Yun-hee proposed emergency construction of Guardian stations throughout Coalition space using human dimensional anchor technology. These installations would serve as stable points in reality that could resist Void Devourer attacks while providing bases for counter-offensive operations. However, the stations would require permanent human crews to maintain the consciousness fields necessary for their operation. The political implications were staggering as Coalition species realized they would need to accept human authority in matters of dimensional defense. Many representatives resisted the idea of subordinating their military forces to human command. But the alternatives were becoming clear as more star systems fell to the advancing Void Devourers. Insu compiled intelligence reports showing the true scope of the threat facing galactic civilization. The entity incursions were accelerating as more dimensional barriers failed, and the Void Devourers gained footholds in normal space from which to launch larger assaults. Conservative estimates suggested that without effective resistance, the entire galaxy would be consumed within a matter of decades. HFY volunteered to serve aboard the first prototype Guardian station, despite the risks involved in working closely with human dimensional technology. Her HFY site was retrofitted with reality anchor systems that required her to maintain specific meditative states while operating the equipment. The mental strain was enormous, but she gradually learned to perceive the subtle wrongness that indicated Void Devourer activity. The first major success came when a joint human coalition force managed to close a dimensional rift that had opened near the Threk's homeworld. The operation required perfect coordination between human consciousness specialists and coalition fleet, elements using hybrid technology that pushed both species to their limits. The victory proved that cooperation was possible, but also demonstrated the enormous challenges involved. Young Six served as HFY's science officer aboard the experimental Guardian station and quickly learned that fighting extra-dimensional threats required abandoning everything he thought he knew about physics and mathematics. Reality itself became a weapon that could be wielded by those with sufficient mental discipline, but the effort required was unlike anything demanded by conventional warfare. As reports came in from across Coalition space, the scope of the disaster became clear. The Void Devourers were not just attacking random targets, but systematically dismantling the infrastructure of galactic civilization. Trade routes became unusable as space-time distortions made navigation impossible, and communication networks failed as the mathematical constants underlying faster-than-light transmission became unreliable. The choice facing every coalition species was stark and unavoidable. Accept human guidance and transform their entire civilization to fight extra-dimensional threats, or watch everything they had built over thousands of years be consumed by enemies that existed beyond the reach of conventional resistance. The comfortable assumption that the universe operated according to predictable laws had been shattered forever, and survival now required embracing truths that most minds could barely comprehend. Ambassador So Young found herself negotiating for the survival of galactic civilization as reality continued to break down around them. Void Devourers poured through dimensional rifts at an accelerating rate, consuming entire star systems and leaving behind emptiness that was more complete than any natural vacuum. The Coalition's proud fleets and advanced technology proved utterly helpless against enemies that treated the laws of physics as mere suggestions to be ignored. The crystalline Valari homeworld had vanished completely in less than 6 hours, as the extra-dimensional entities consumed not just matter and energy, but the very concept of existence itself. Billions of sentient beings had not died, but simply ceased to be as if they had never existed at all. The psychological impact on surviving coalition species was devastating as they realized their fundamental assumptions about reality were completely wrong. Commander Ji-hoon stood before the emergency session of the High Council and offered humanity's assistance in fighting the Void Devourer invasion. However, his terms were non-negotiable and required the coalition to acknowledge humanity as the galaxy's guardians with authority over all matters related to dimensional defense. More importantly, every species would need to contribute resources and personnel for the continuing war against extra-dimensional threats. The human commander explained that this was not merely about military cooperation, but required a fundamental transformation of how galactic civilization operated. Fighting the Void Devourers was not a temporary crisis that could be resolved and forgotten, but an eternal conflict that would demand constant vigilance and sacrifice from every sentient species in the galaxy. Chief Engineer Bo-Ra led emergency programs to retrofit coalition technology with human reality anchor systems, but the process proved agonizing for non-human engineers. Human equipment required operators to maintain specific consciousness states that most coalition species found nearly impossible to achieve. The mental discipline necessary for using dimensional anchor technology was beyond anything demanded. By conventional physics, Dong-Hyun took command of Joint Coalition Human Defense Operations and began the brutal process of teaching alien commanders how to fight enemies that could alter reality itself. The learning curve was steep and deadly, as traditional military thinking proved worse than useless against opponents who could attack from dimensions that three-dimensional minds could not perceive or comprehend. Every successful engagement against the Void Devourers required perfect coordination between human consciousness specialists and coalition personnel using hybrid technology that pushed both species to their absolute limits. For every minor victory, dozens of ships were lost to attacks that violated every known principle of warfare as the entities struck from directions that did not exist, using weapons that unmade their targets at the quantum level. Dr. Yun-hee worked frantically to establish Guardian stations throughout Coalition space, using human dimensional anchor technology combined with Coalition manufacturing capabilities. The installations would serve as stable points in reality that could resist Void Devourer attacks while providing bases for counteroffensive operations. However, each station required permanent human crews to maintain the consciousness fields necessary for their operation. The political implications were staggering as coalition representatives struggled to accept their new reality. Species that had considered themselves the masters of galactic civilization were forced to acknowledge their complete dependence on human protection against threats they could not even perceive. Many delegates resisted the idea of subordinating their sovereignty to human authority, but the alternatives were becoming clear with each passing day. INSU compiled intelligence reports showing the accelerating pace of dimensional breach activity across coalition space. Conservative estimates suggested that without massive intervention, the entire galaxy would be consumed by Void Devourers within 2 decades. The entities were not just randomly destructive, but followed systematic patterns designed to dismantle the infrastructure of normal reality and prepare for large-scale invasion from their native dimension. Captain Haewon commanded the first successful Joint Human Coalition vessel designed specifically for fighting extra-dimensional threats. Her ship Eternal Vigil combined human consciousness technology with coalition manufacturing techniques to create a vessel that could operate effectively in areas where space-time itself was under attack. The mental strain of operating such equipment was enormous, but she gradually learned to perceive the subtle wrongness that indicated enemy activity. The breakthrough came when human engineers successfully adapted their reality anchor technology to work with coalition neural patterns. The hybrid systems allowed non-human operators to maintain dimensional stability through assisted consciousness fields that amplified their natural mental abilities. The technology was difficult and dangerous to use, but offered hope that other species could contribute meaningfully to the war effort. Young Sik served as science officer aboard one of the new Guardian stations and experienced firsthand the challenge of maintaining reality anchors against Void Devourer attacks. The work required abandoning everything he thought he knew about physics and mathematics as he learned to perceive and manipulate dimensions that existed beyond normal space-time. The mental effort was unlike anything demanded by conventional science. The first major victory came when joint forces successfully closed a dimensional rift that had opened near the galactic core, threatening to destabilize space-time throughout the entire region. The operation required thousands of human consciousness specialists, working in perfect harmony with coalition fleet elements, using technology that existed at the very limits of what either species could comprehend. The success proved that cooperation was possible, but also demonstrated the enormous resources required. As the crisis deepened, Ambassador So Young found herself negotiating the terms of what would become known as the New Covenant. This galactic agreement acknowledged humanity's role as guardians while establishing frameworks for other species to contribute to the continuing war against extra-dimensional threats. The document represented a complete transformation of galactic civilization from comfortable ignorance to informed vigilance. The new covenant established Guardian stations throughout coalition space as permanent installations designed to monitor and maintain dimensional barriers. Each station would be jointly staffed by human consciousness specialists and coalition personnel trained in hybrid technology. The facilities would serve not just as military installations, but as centers for ongoing research into extra-dimensional threats and defensive technologies. Bora explained to coalition engineers that the war against the Void Devourers would never truly end because the entities existed outside normal time and could potentially attack from any point in the past or future. Maintaining galactic security would require permanent vigilance and continuous technological development to stay ahead of enemies that learned and adapted with each engagement. The psychological impact of these revelations transformed Coalition. Society as species that had lived in comfortable assumption of universal physical laws were forced to confront the reality that existence itself was under constant threat. Educational systems were rebuilt to teach dimensional awareness, while military academies incorporated human consciousness training into their core curricula. Admiral Tae Min accepted command of the new Joint Defense Force with the understanding that traditional military thinking was inadequate for fighting extra-dimensional threats. His fleets were rebuilt using hybrid technology that required crews trained in both conventional warfare and consciousness manipulation techniques. The transformation was difficult, and many veterans struggled to adapt to fighting enemies that could ignore physical reality. The establishment of the new covenant marked the beginning of a new era in galactic history as every sentient species acknowledged their dependence on human sacrifice and their responsibility to contribute to the continuing war. Trade agreements included provisions for dimensional defense, and diplomatic treaties required signatories to accept human authority in matters related to extra-dimensional security. 1 year after the crisis began, Ambassador So Young stood aboard. Guardian Station Eternal Vigil, watching human and coalition crews work together to maintain the barriers that protected reality itself. The galaxy had changed forever, becoming more dangerous, but also more honest about the true cost of survival. Species that had once competed for resources and territory now cooperated in the face of threats that could erase them all from existence. Commander Ji-hoon approached with his daily report on dimensional barrier status, and So Young realized that humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy had not been their advanced technology or their willingness to sacrifice themselves for others. Their true contribution was teaching the rest of galactic civilization that some wars were worth fighting forever, and some prices were worth paying to preserve the basic right of sentient beings to exist in a universe governed by comprehensible laws. The comfortable era of coalition politics based on assumption of permanent peace and predictable physics had ended forever.